Welcome to the GreenPill.network podcast. In September, GreenPill will be hosted by the Cartographers, a high context community of individuals and teams dedicated to advancing the Web3 grants ecosystem. They'll explore the Web3 grants ecosystem with topics ranging from novel funding mechanisms, grant councils, and governance to emerging trends like AI and direct to contract incentives. This series seeks to bridge theory and practice by examining real world examples and featuring discussions with those who are closest to the action. The next voice you hear will be Sav, who contributes at Gitcoin and founded the Cartographers. Sav will be hosting this entire season. And I think that it's going to be a great season because Sav brings deep experience in Web3 grants and capital allocation. I'm excited for you to hear some of the perspectives from him and his guests. Without further ado, the next voice you'll hear is Sav. Enjoy.
So coordination, we are back with another episode of the Green Pill. I'm super excited about this one. It's all about legal considerations, legal wrappers of grant programs and DAOs. I've got with me on the pod today Gabriel Shapiro, who many of you may know by following him on CT. I know I do. I have for some time. Really like his thoughts. And so this episode really came as a result of like just a random DM that I sent him and he answered. And like, here we are. So I'm excited to jump in a little bit. We're going to talk about just kind of legal structures for grant giving organizations in Web3, some of the stuff that Gabe's doing around Borgs, compliance considerations, risk management, all that fun stuff, and then pick his brain a little bit on future trends and where we see things going that way in Web3. So first, Gabe, I'll turn it over to you. Maybe give us a little intro, give us your background and what you're doing these days with MetaLeX.
My name is Gabriel Shapiro. I'm LexNode on Twitter, and I've been a lawyer for about 14 years, crypto lawyer for about 7 years. And I have a company called MetaLeX, which specializes in creating hybrid crypto and legal solutions. So combining legal agreements with smart contracts, basically, and tailoring the legal arrangements and governance arrangements accordingly.
Nice. And so maybe just like jumping in right there, what kind of prompted you to start the organization? I know I've been following your work since I think the original Borg, paper that you put out with, I think it was Delphi. You've got some recent work with Lido and a few others. What really prompted this? What were the problems you saw in the industry that you were really looking to solve?
Yeah, I mean, I've been advising mostly DeFi teams for years, and so became familiar with a lot of their regulatory issues and their governance and product issues, and how all of those things interrelate. And I think one of the things that's very interesting is like a lot of lawyers, especially U.S. lawyers, are some of the biggest decentralization maxis in the space, and immutability maxis, because they realize that creates the best regulatory story for projects, right? Like obviously the greatest regulatory story in crypto is Bitcoin because it had a quote unquote fair launch and it wasn't VC funded, and it's sort of like close to immutable. It has this idea of a hard cap supply and all these things, right? And so lawyers try to get every project to be like that. But the more that I engaged with builders, the more I found that agility is necessary for a lot of these projects. Mutability is needed for a lot of these projects, and that there are a lot of social elements to these projects. And so what was happening with DAOs and protocols was like, they're like, well, DAOs move too slow. It's too big of a coordination problem. We like the DAO, but we basically want a small, nimble committee, which takes the form of being on a so-called multi-sig, a smart contract with, that requires multiple signatures of different private key holders in order to execute each action. They're forming these committees. And so I started to say, okay, all right, I get it. You want the committees. You don't want everything to be decided on a fully decentralized basis. Let's talk about these committees. What can they do? What are the potential liabilities? They're holding money. Are they holding that money? Can they do whatever they want with that money? Or do they have to do only certain things? And the more that I worked on these issues, the more I realized the solutions that people were using kind of fell into two categories, both of which I would describe as kind of like the worst of both worlds, right? One is just like throw a bunch of people onto this multi-sig. There's no rules about what they have to do, really. There's no legal structures around it. They're just on a multi-sig. They get some money. They get some smart contract admin powers, and their high reputation, so we hope it goes well, right? But nevertheless, it would be described as if it's much more specific. Like if it's a multi-sig that had the power to freeze the protocol in an attack, well, they would say, oh, it's a security multi-sig. But I would say, well, is there anything that's stopping them from freezing the protocol just because they feel like it? No, there's nothing stopping them actually, right? But we still describe it as they can only stop it in the event of a hack, right? So there's kind of that. And then there was this kind of other structure of like, let's just give lots and lots and lots of money, like millions of dollars, like many years of budget to a foundation, and say it's for the purpose of this community and hope they do good things, right? And so those are kind of like the two opposite extremes. And my idea was basically to combine them, right? So it's kind of the worst of both worlds because it's like you get no legal protection, but you also get like all of the trust that's typically involved in legal arrangements, and you have no shareholders or accountability like you would in a normal company, right? So I said, actually, let's just take the best of each of the things, right? You can get limited liability for the people who are on these things. You can get all the good smart contract rules. Like, let's actually write these multi-sigs so that they can only do what the DAO expects, or like, enforce that as much as possible. And let's also put those rules in the legal agreements as well, right? And then you kind of cover all your bases. So then I was like, okay, well, what do we call this, right? It's basically like a multi-sig that's wrapped by a foundation entity or some sort of other legal entity. Don't want to call it a DAO because it's only like run by 6 people. That's not very decentralized. So I was like, oh, let's call it, it's kind of like cybernetic. It involves law and smart contracts. So we'll call it cybernetic organizations or boards, right? And so we started with that meme, and basically people became very interested in it, saw a lot of demand for it. So I started MetaLeX as a project to focus on that, both tailoring the legal arrangements for it and actually building out a new smart contract stack that is specific to this use case.
Fascinating. No, I mean, all those things that you described definitely ring true to me. I can definitely see the trade-offs between, getting all the signatures you need can be slow, getting the approvals that you need can be slow. We want to be able to move fast and break things, as they say. Maybe not break things so much, but at least have some speed to the work that we do. And then there's also, I've seen it from the side that I'm on with a few DAOs where, because we want to have those controls in place, maybe we force like budgeting to be like a quarterly process, right? Where like you're creating this budget and you're only asking for quarterly budgets from the time block, and you've got to go get all these votes to do that. And by the time that you get those like all of that process done, budgets allocated, a week later, you're back into that process of creating budgets again. And you spend a lot of your time just in kind of like planning and spreadsheets and like all these things. And you're not really driving impact. You're just like moving numbers around on the ledger to get the time lock to unlock funds so that you can do it again a week later, and so you're really taking that and moving some of that responsibility downstream, but doing that in a way that it's wrapped, it's understood, it's well documented. You get the benefits of kind of like the speed and precision all in once. And so that is Borg's, and congratulations, you have like one of the coolest names in crypto in terms of like your product, right? So maybe walk us through, what is MetaLeXOS? What are the components of that? Like, what does that really enable if I'm someone that's working in a DAO or, in a grant giving organization?
Yeah, so we start with Gnosis Safe, right? It's battle tested. That's what everyone uses for DAO adjacent multi-sigs anyway, or almost any, at least on Ethereum. And we don't change the code of that at all. It's very good. It's very secure. It has built into it, something like hooks for other smart contracts to come in and modify the functionality, right? So these are basically, one type is called a guard, which can constrain what the multi-sig can do. So, a classic example would be, we only want this multi-sig to be able to interact with like 3 Uniswap pools, and we don't want to be able to do any other transactions. Its only job is to basically like rebalance liquidity among these 3 pools or something like that, right? So you could use a guard to whitelist those contracts, and basically it can't do anything else. It can't steal the money because it can't send it to EOAs, right? All that sort of thing. The other function that it has is called modules, right? And modules are basically opportunities for other smart contracts to come in and do something with the multi-sigs assets without the signers approving. And so, you could have like an oracle that's just monitoring, I don't know, the price of some token. And when that price target is hit, the smart contract causes that multi-sig to release some funds to someone who bet that price target would be hit within some certain time, right? And a module can do that. So altogether, we call these, these MetaLeX guards and implants for safes. We call them guards and modules. We call them implants, going with the cybernetics theme, right? And the main ones we use in the grant context, since you're focused on that, are ones that basically, a good example would be rate limiting, right? So let's just say that the DAO had authorized they really wanted a grants program that's oriented around the idea of fire starter, right? Like give lots and lots of small grants to lots and lots of teams over 3 years and see what comes of it, right? Okay, well, I mean, you can certainly put that in the legal documents that wrap the multi-sig. You could say it's a fire starter grants program to benefit this particular community. Each grant should be somewhere between $25,000 and $50,000, and the money that you got should last you 3 years, right? But I think we can do better because if it's just legal agreements, that imposes what in governance we call monitoring costs, right? Which is that someone has to. It's fine to have the agreement, but someone has to actually monitor that it's being complied with. And then if it's not complied with, they have to take some legal action to set things right. The beauty of smart contracts is you can dramatically reduce monitoring costs. Why? Because you could actually put that rate limitation into the smart contract, right? Using these implants, you could basically say you can't do a grant of more than 25K or 50K, right? You can't do more than 4 of them a month and things like this. And you can build in flexibility where if for some reason they want to do a larger grant, okay, you can do it. But then through the implant, the DAO has to co-approve it. So then both the signers and the DAO have to approve that particular grant, right? So it's a check and balance type of dynamic. Now they could end run this, right? They could do 3 50K grants to the same person. But then that's why you have the legal rules, because to show that would still clearly be a violation, even though it kind of did an end run around the on-chain controls. So this is an example of how we can pull from the legal world and the on-chain world to get something that's more trust minimized and efficient and less costly than either could achieve by itself.
Gotcha. Yeah. So in that case, it sounds like the DAO through their normal governance processes would be the ones that would set these policies, right? Like
Yes.
configure the implants that would be pushed downstream, into the Borgs, and then if material changes need to occur to those implants, then that goes through the traditional process of governance, right? And
Exactly.
so you're kind of abstracting that away where you're only leaving up change management, the most important decisions, like those things at that higher layer. And then it's downstream to the Borgs where they have more span of control. They can have speed and efficiency. They have some guardrails in place. Is that kind of accurate to say?
Exactly. And it kind of tracks with just the evolution of blockchain in general, right? We've gone from this model of monolithic blockchains to this much more modular approach, right? Of having a data availability layer, having the L1 provide the most fundamental layer of security, but then there's a higher layer of the L2 where it's more discretionary. There are more kind of off-chain dependencies and stuff. But at the end of the day, people have that confidence that there's an exit route to this more decentralized layer. It's the same exact philosophy, just transposed onto more of this governance context, and some of these legal mechanisms.
Got it. And so with MetaLeX, is it primarily kind of the technology stack that you have that you're building out, driving adoption of, or does MetaLeX offer, kind of consultation services, these types of things on top of that stack to help implement, guide, et cetera?
Yeah, we have both a law firm and a tech company, right? So yeah, we basically do both. We draft the legal documents and form the entities for people, and we also deploy the parameterize and deploy the software that goes with it. And we have a web app that kind of is an easy interface for interacting with those smart contracts and keeping track of the legal agreements. So yeah, it aims to be kind of end to end for these for the Borgs, and it even gives the DAO a way to if there's a veto power of the Borg, the DAO will be able to do it directly from our web app and stuff like that. It's sort of non-exclusive, right? Because obviously every DAO still has its core governance app that it can still use for the same purposes if it wants. And you could still use the standard Gnosis Safe UI, but our interface will be opinionated to this purpose, and that will make it probably faster and more legible and that sort of thing.
Right on, right on. Would you be able to talk us through kind of like the most well-known implementation of it today? I know it's like Lido that you've been working with. A lot of that's in public forums, but for their alliance, is that something you could kind of walk us through what that looks like in practice?
Yeah, I think there are two. There are kind of like two big ones that announced last month. One was Lido's Alliance Borg, and another one was the ZK Sync ecosystem. The Lido one is probably easiest to understand. It's basically a a DAO adjacent entity that exists just to kind of facilitate alliances between the Lido community and other communities. And as part of that, those allied communities will be donating tokens from their projects to this entity. Someone might reasonably say, like, okay, why don't you just, like, the DAO should just get all those tokens, like, just put them directly in the DAO, make this a partnership between two DAOs. Like, the issue with that is that would basically turn Lido DAO into like a giant on-chain hedge fund or venture capital fund, right? Like, a lot of times these alliances will be made before the project's token even exists. So you're talking about taking some kind of like SAFT or SAFE or other security, from these things, and DAOs just aren't equipped to do that. DAOs are basically smart contracts, right? So this entity exists to basically say, hey, we're an entity that is in the business of facilitating collaboration between these two communities. We own these assets. We will manage these assets in a way that is likely going to be beneficial to the Lido community, but it's not like LDO tokens are like pro rata claims to these assets, right? Because that would make them into securities. So, but at the same time, you want to have some checks and balances on this. So it's like, Lido DAO has to approve, any new directors of this entity, and it has to approve who the allied communities will be, right? That's kind of the whole point, is that the communities like each other. Mm-hmm. So you need a Lido DAO approval for that. And the rules of the entity kind of set all this forth. So that's the way that one works. In the case of ZK Sync, I think there's kind of even more cybernetic elements to it, because basically the Borgs that they have are integrally involved in their process flow of doing protocol upgrades, right? So the way that and doing token mints, right? So the way they set up their thing is that there's a security Borg, which is a Cayman's Foundation wrapping a multisig, and there is a Guardians Borg, which is another Cayman's Foundation wrapping another multisig. And their proposal for doing protocol upgrades is that basically first they don't actually call it a DAO, they call it a token assembly. First a token assembly, or they have another contract called a GovOps module, but whatever. It's some smart contract through a token voting process, first approves it, right? And then the security Borg evaluates it like, okay, is this secure? Will this break anything? And basically has like a veto power, right? If it thinks it's insecure, it will veto it. And the rules of the entity really help here because they kind of define what's going to be the evaluation process. What are the criteria by which you would regard something as non-secure, right? And how will you communicate about that and things like that, right? And then if the security Borg, sort of approves it or doesn't veto it, then there's also this guardian entity, which is more about looking at the values of the community and making sure this is not some sort of governance attack in light of those values. And it has a veto power. So it basically ends up meaning that, like, you need two of three to do anything, right? You need either the DAO plus the security thing, or the DAO plus the Guardians, or the Guardians plus the security Borg. And it's a check and balance dynamic. And it's all on chain through these multisigs. Like, it's not some kind of social process. Like, literally an upgrade to the system can't happen unless, one of these multisig approvals plus one of these DAO approvals, is issued on chain.
Interesting. I can't help but hear you talk and kind of think about some of the potential for AI LLMs, right? Where could you create a Borg that is driven completely by an artificial intelligence? You put those guardrails around it, it can serve that function, but you kind of create those boundaries on what it can and can't do. I'm guessing like those are things you're probably already thinking of and maybe even starting to explore, right?
It's only a matter of time. Like, in our white paper, we talk about the golem like how like it's like a clay monster and you put code in it and it becomes alive,
Mhm.
right? I mean, we already have artificial persons in the world. They're like corporations are legal persons, right? They're non-human persons. So this is something we already understand. So, I mean, to me, I think you could wrap, like an arrangement of, they're calling them AI agents, but basically, AIs combined with blockchain bots and smart contracts. If you add those three things together, they basically are autonomous. And now, if you basically say, okay, a legal entity owns these things, now suddenly that thing has personhood, right? This is an inevitability that we will be creating artificial persons that are AIs plus blockchain. I mean, I think it could happen any day. I think if people really wanted to do it, they probably could do it today. Honestly, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm already seeing some teams out there starting to put together. I think it's the Blockful team, that I've worked with a little bit on Trustful and some other things that they've developed, but starting to create kind of like an AI agent that can participate in governance, and you're delegating tokens to truly an AI that's making those decisions. And so I think there's lots of all sorts of kind of like interesting applications of AI in
And
our
how
space.
is the legal system going to deal with this? I mean, it's a very interesting question,
Yeah.
right? Because the whole purpose of a legal entity is it's supposed to confer limited liability. That is, like, only the assets that are owned by the entity are supposed to be at stake if that entity does something wrong, right? Not the shareholders, not the people who set it up. In fact, me as a lawyer, I've been the sole incorporator of many, many Delaware entities. And the reason why I'm comfortable doing that is because there's quite clear law that I can be released, that I have no liability for what that entity does in the future,
Mhm.
right? So that is the law currently. But now you're talking. I somehow have a feeling that once you start, putting AIs into these entities, that suddenly people are going to be saying, we got to sue the person who set this up, even though they had no ongoing control. We got to find some way, to hold them responsible, right? Because they decided the rules. And so it's going to open up very interesting questions and challenges.
Yeah, no, it's a great segue. Kind of like the next questions I had for you is like, where do you see, like, obviously right now, it feels like we're starting to make some strides around kind of like better, like having at least a positive intent to better define regulatory guidelines, like these types of things. But I think we're still a long way off from clarity, do you anticipate, that changing? Do you see things changing that way from your purview, or is it something where that's just going to be kind of a stalemate, and that's why solutions like Borg's really make a lot of sense, right?
I think in Europe there now is clarity, right? We have this huge law called MiCA that really treats crypto as, for the most part, a separate asset class and gives it its own rules and processes and licensing requirements and things like that, right? So we have that in the EU. In the U.S., we have there's nothing like that, and I think the problem in the U.S. is these regulatory turf wars between agencies, right? That mean anything that we get in the U.S. that is clear is likely to be a whole lot more complex nonetheless, because you kind of have to give a piece of the market to each of these regulators. That's just part of the political compromise of it all, right? And so, like, there was an act called Fit 21 that had gotten some traction. I believe it's mainly being pushed by Coinbase, and their proxies. But it kind of basically creates like a dual regulatory regime between the SEC and the CFTC, where, like, tokens are initially securities or covered by the securities laws, and then there are certain ways that they can become commodities. And it'd be very, very complex. That's all I can say. But that's the type of solution that I guess is most likely to occur in the U.S. just because of the political realities. And people say it will create clarity. I think it will create a lot of new, like, battlefronts and confusions as well, right? So I don't think I think there will be like a long time of like gray areas in crypto. Probably our entire lifetimes, honestly, will have like be full of many legal battles and ambiguities, and things around crypto, even if one of these acts are passed, because it's just too complicated, too new, too different from existing paradigms where everything just sits on an intermediary's ledger. And so it's just very easy to regulate that intermediary. And then you just, by virtue of doing that, you regulate the entire market, right? That's just not crypto, and it's never going to be crypto. And nothing paradigm shift of that is, no matter what bills you pass, whatever, it's going to take still like decades, I think, to play out. Yeah. And so for Borgs, there's different ways. Yes, like if things remain gray, I think it's a good approach to kind of like mitigating risk. But even if things become more clear, it's still going to be very multi-jurisdictional, and relatively decentralized. And so people, like I was saying earlier, with like the modular approach to blockchains generally, people are going to need to have like modularity. Like, oh, we want a certain entity to go and become licensed as a CASP in Europe, but we probably don't want to put all our eggs in that basket, right? We maybe want to give it like 2 or 3 years of runway, but we also want to spin one up in Dubai, right? And we want to spin one up in the UK, and they're all going to require different licenses. You could try to have one big monolithic entity that just gets all the licenses, right? But that's not very DAO friendly. I think, I'm pretty confident that like not everyone wants to become the next Coinbase. They can do that sort of thing, right? And then just have these all be subsidiaries. But I think people are going to want this more modular, agile, programmable entity approach. And I think we're well positioned for that world as well.
Nice, nice. So maybe to kind of like in the episode out, like a question for you is, if I'm an existing grant program, or maybe I'm contemplating launching a grant program, right? I think there's kind of like two different camps there. As a grant manager, as a stakeholder in that, like, what should I be thinking of, right? Like, what are the things that you would advise that, people in those positions kind of think through as they design these types of programs, specifically in kind of like your domain?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the number one, I'll speak now. I'll speak first from the perspective of like the people on the grants committee, right? Number one would be tax in my mind, right? Because if you just jump on a naked multi-sig and you put a bunch of money in it, and it's people from all different jurisdictions, you may have just gotten you may be an unincorporated partnership that just received a bunch of income, right? But you don't intend to actually personally take that money, but you could potentially be tax responsible for it anyway, right? So that's very bad. And that's like kind of like your biggest risk probably right off the bat, is that you have some like unknown tax risk. There's also in the US, like particularly if there are US people involved, there's these incredibly complex rules about passive foreign income and controlled foreign corporations, and how you have to report this, and reporting about foreign accounts, which a multi-sig may be some sort of account, all these things, right? So you're really stepping into a landmine right there. And so right off the bat, that suggests, deliberately make it like a Cayman Foundation or something in some tax optimized jurisdiction. Think very carefully about the composition of who's on the multi-sig to make sure that only Caymans has tax claim to it, as opposed to the US, for example. All those things. That's number one. Number two is, what is the mandate of this? What are the rules, right? Probably in the proposal that approves all this, it probably uses some fairly imprecise language like grants that benefit Lido or something. Okay, well, what does Lido mean? Is Lido the validators, the LDO holders, the STETH holders? Like who is Lido? And does it have to benefit all of them every time? Can it benefit some more than others, right? Is there a rule of priority among how you're supposed to rank those different stakeholders' interests, right? All those things. So, it's good to have in words, more precise words, what constitutes a good grant, right? And you could put that in some sort of legal document, right? The other thing is like, okay, how are you going to do member management over time, right? People may get bored of this. They may leave. How are you going to manage those transitions? How are you going to appoint new people, right? And so, personally, I think if the DAO is kind of funding this thing, right, it probably should have some ongoing input into that. Like if the DAO thinks that someone is doing a particularly horrible job, it should probably have at least some ability to, like, if not unilaterally remove someone, at least trigger a process that could lead to reviewing and removing them, right? Or if it thinks it wants new blood, it should have input into who the new blood is, right? And so you can do all these things. You can do them legally, or you can do them with smart contracts, like just literally giving the DAO a right to like remove someone from a multi-sig, and then you say in the legal docs, whoever's on the multi-sig is automatically a director, right? Things like that. So those are the things. Yeah, I mean, you kind of cover most of your bases with that, right? You have a legal entity. That means you have limited liability. You put it in a good tax jurisdiction. That means you're probably not going to have a huge tax problem. And you have rules and some measure of accountability, so you know what you're being measured against. You know how not to do things that will like if someone tries to sue you, you'll be able to point at the specific rules and say you followed them. So that's pretty good. And yeah, just right there, I think you've like checked most of the boxes. Obviously, you could get even more granular from there, like grant, like figuring out grant sizes and monitoring that and all that sort of thing. But those are the really big points, and most people don't even get the really big points right.
Definitely. No, so I guess one last question is like, how do people find out more information on the work that you're doing? We check out the website. What does that look like?
Yeah. So we have a website, MetaLeX.tech. Right now, the app is very close to being live. We're just figuring out like which Borg will be first, basically. So right now, it's just kind of a landing page with a wait list. But if you're interested in using us, you can certainly sign up for the wait list. We have a Telegram chat as well, which is linked to from that page. So that's a pretty big community now. I think like 350 people. That's probably the best way, just to like jump in, chat, ask questions, check out the articles we have linked. Yeah, I'd say that's probably like the number one way to interact with us.
Right on. Well, we definitely appreciate you being on the show. I learned a lot through this. I think the audience definitely will as well. We'll make sure and put in the show notes where you can find, Gabriel and the work that he's doing with MetaLeX. And we look forward to having one more episode of the Greenpill podcast with me hosting. That will be focused on AI and LLM, I think will be the next episode. So looking forward to everyone joining in. Gabriel, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, man. Really appreciate it.